Welcome back to Introduction to Political Science, Chapter 3, Ideologies. In this picture, a businessman debates with protesters in the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York in September 2011, who occupied part of New York's financial district to protest rising inequality in the United States. To even begin to grasp their positions and debate, we need to understand the ideas and language of the ideologies behind them. This chapter has 4 learning objectives. In 3.1, you will define political knowledge, political culture, and political ideology. In 3.2, you will identify the main principles of classical liberalism, modern liberalism, and modern conservatism. In 3.3, you will identify the main principles of socialism and fascism. And in 3.4, you will identify the main principles of environmentalism and political Islamism. Ideologies generate language, behaviors, and boundaries of mainstream political life. Ideologies are also key to understanding terrorism and other forms of extremism. Let's begin by asking what is and isn't ideology. This is related to Learning Objective 3.1, define political knowledge, political culture, and political ideology. So what is ideology? It could be said that they are packages of beliefs about how politics work and should work. They are also rough, guiding theories of real-world action, and many people's political views are incoherent because they have not thought carefully about their ideology. What is not ideology is political knowledge, political opinion, political culture. Let's focus on political knowledge for just a second. Actual facts do not depend on your viewpoint or ideology, and facts are critical to effective political thinking. In the United States, polls show that political knowledge is sketchy. In fact, political elites have a high level of knowledge. The middle 50 to 60% can answer simple questions, but they know only about very recent events, little beyond that. The remainder knows little, except for hard-to-avoid facts, such as the president's name. These middle and lower groups merge into a poorly informed majority. Polls show that they may not have the most important information. Polls also show that they do know trivial details. Some good sources to build your knowledge from the textbook include Politico.com, RealClearPolitics.com, 538.com, PolitiFact.com, FactCheck.org, OnTheIssues.org, NewYorkTimes.com, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and the Christian Science Monitor, the CIA World Factbook, Index Mundi, the World Bank data, and Gapminder.com. Turning to public opinion and political culture, this is related to that question, what are you expected to know? Most Americans hold a smattering of political ideas. Opinions change based on the wording of polls and surveys. Political culture are those ways of talking, practices of acting, and sets of justifying stories about politics that people perceive as appropriate for most Americans. Political culture suggests background assumptions that may not be consciously justified. In public opinion, there are effects of socialization and subcultures. Socialization is powerful in families and peer groups. You tend to believe the things of those who are closest to you. And interaction among people who identify with certain subcultures can carry expectations. Let's talk about the liberal tradition. This is related to Learning Objective 3.2, identify the main principles of classical liberalism, modern liberalism, and modern conservatism. The word liberalism is related to both the modern left and the modern right. Practically all American politicians adhere to a variant of liberalism. Yes, even those conservatives in the United States. There is some confusion about the words liberty and liberal. Liberal refers to individual rights, such as the right to free speech, freedom of religion, and more. Liberalism's roots can be traced back to a defense of individual political liberties by John Locke and advocacy of open markets by Adam Smith. So one principle is political rights. It's aimed for the political liberties of individuals. And political rights were really developed in Europe between the 1500s and 1700s. Ideas like freedom of religion for non-aristocrats were developed by thinkers like John Locke, discussed in the previous chapter. With classical liberalism, political rights became important. Representation became important as well. The right to select leaders through elections. Liberal rights plus elections equal liberal democracy. And it continues to animate revolutions today. For example, the Arab Spring back in the early 2010s. The second principle is related to free markets. Property was one of Locke's natural rights, and the influence of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations would be seen as well. For Smith, individuals would produce whatever they were most productive at producing. People would seek the lure of wealth and avoid the fear of poverty. Smith believed economic liberty led to productive society. Let's talk about the divide between negative liberty versus positive liberty. The liberal agenda dominated in some of the richest countries in the world by the late 1800s. However, liberals would begin to have disagreements with one another. Some liberals thought that goals were achieved by the movement of liberalism. Today, this group is seen as the conservatives. Some thought there was more work to be done, and today we would identify this group as modern liberals. Modern liberals believe that there had been achieved negative liberty, which is freedom from the abuse or restraint by government. Modern liberals also believe that they needed positive liberty, which is the capacity to develop one's talent and pursue opportunities. And so modern liberals today believe that there is a need to reduce barriers to success, improve access to education, healthcare, and more, to reduce poverty and discrimination. Modern liberals would advocate for a more active, supportive government. This means the government would take on more social programs funded by taxes on richer Americans. And the vision of liberty for all included less traditional ways of life. In this photograph, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the architects of modern liberalism in the United States, visits a civilian conservation corps camp in 1933. The CCC, as it was called, created jobs for millions of unemployed young men to work on public projects during the Great Depression, symbolizing government action to help poorer citizens in tough times. This debate between proponents of classical liberalism continues today wherever liberal democracy has dominated. The focus on negative liberty and deregulated markets is now considered modern conservatism. The focus on positive liberty and active government is seen as the opposite of conservatism, or what's known today as the modern liberal. Only in the United States does the word liberal relate to a government that pursues social change. The use of the term began under President Roosevelt's New Deal. Today, conservative Republicans and Tea Partiers are actually classical liberals. The rest of the world uses liberal to mean classical liberalism. Words like liberal and neoliberal in other countries are often seen as conservative in American terms. Both major political parties in America share a strong tradition of liberal democracy. This parallel vocabulary has emerged since the 19th century. On the left are proponents of social reform who push for social and political rights for all. On the right are opponents of social reform who believe in defense of established norms and laws. Unlike the terms liberal and conservative, the words left and right are universally understood in politics. Let's turn to modern conservatism and its variants. Today, modern conservatism is a discussion mainly of the religious right, libertarians, and neoconservatives. They draw heavily on classical liberalism and adds emphasis to tradition and authority. In modern conservatism, the first principle is related to classical liberalism. Leaders in modern conservatism present themselves as champions of limited government, low taxes, free markets, and economic liberty. Ronald Reagan called for a return to 19th century liberal principles while he was in office. Small government advocates believe that low taxes benefit even the most disadvantaged. In this headline from the British Daily Mail's coverage of the death of Margaret Thatcher in 2013, she was known as the Iron Lady for her unapologetic conservatism. Thatcher remains a powerful symbol of the neoliberal movement for smaller government and less regulated markets. For modern conservatives, they believe that government is already so open, it does not need to intervene to provide positive liberties. Modern conservatives believe that groups already have equal access to opportunity. Government programs would be counterproductive. It would soften the consequences of failure, and Adam Smith felt that the fear of poverty was a big motivator. The reason modern conservatives believe government programs would be counterproductive is because of the high potential for unintended consequences. Things like high taxes make the rich less motivated to succeed and invest, which theoretically would lead to fewer opportunities for the poor. The second principle of modern conservatism is related to the idea, the preference of tradition, experience, and authority over radical change. This is largely due to the influence of the father of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke, in his work Reflections on the Revolution in France. In that book, Burke argued that revolutionaries' plans would ultimately lead to chaos. He argued that societies depended on experience and tradition in order to preserve order. And an attempt to move to a new society would be corrupted due to untested ideas and leadership. Burke added that only incremental reforms, small, little changes, will work. He thought aristocracy was the best form of government. Remember from Aristotle's belief in the view of minority rule, where a small group of educated, well-off policymakers would lead a people. Many people thought Burke was vindicated when France fell into chaos following the French Revolution. There are some divides in modern conservatism, especially regarding religion and foreign intervention. On the religious right, there is heavy influence from the works of Joseph de Maistre. He thought that the French Revolution had destroyed the throne and the altar in the name of progress. Religious Americans today identify with conservatism out of a distrust of secular plans for a better society. Religious people in other countries are often politically conservative as well. They sometimes break with classical liberal principles to get government to inform religious-based norms. The religious right is a major part of the modern America conservatism. Christian ideology of modern conservative leaders often comes into the limelight. The Tea Party is a group that is also associated with modern conservatism. They are seen as to the right of the mainstream Republican Party. They rose to prominence in 2009. And it includes many libertarians who seek the most limited possible government in all policy areas. Some advocates for libertarian ideals include Ron Paul, former U.S. congressman who supported strictly limited government powers, but socially liberal policies on issues such as drugs and reproductive rights. Figure 3.1 is a Venn diagram that shows the percentage of overlap between the Christian right, Tea Party supporters, and libertarians in the United States. The Venn diagram shows the following data. Libertarians account for 7% of Americans. 61% of libertarians do not identify with the Tea Party, and 78% do not identify with the Christian right. The Christian right accounts for 18% of Americans. Tea Party supporters account for 10% of Americans, where 26% of Tea Party members are libertarians and 52% identify with the Christian right. Many prominent Tea Party advocates value neoconservatism, which is identified with an assertive foreign policy designed to impose American values of democracy and capitalism on other countries. But notice this is almost the direct opposite of Burke's philosophy regarding the ability to bring out sweeping political change. They may not be very conservative on economic or social issues, but they are almost all religiously devout. They believe that traditional values must be promoted by government, with a particular focus on foreign intervention. Figure 3.2 is a tree illustration that shows classical liberalism with two branches, the left-leaning positive liberty-based ideology of modern liberalism and the right-leaning negative liberty-based ideology of modern conservatism, libertarianism, and the religious right. The negative liberty-based ideology is common to two other trees labeled as Burkean conservatism and religious revelation. Let's talk about older alternatives to the liberal tradition, socialism and fascism. This is related to learning objective 3.3, identify the main principles of socialism and fascism. Americans are not accustomed to meeting actual fascists or socialists. Fascism is the ideology of the losers of World War II, Germany, Italy. These countries are not seen in a positive light. Socialism has been tried in the USSR, but that collapsed in 1992, sending questions on if it's a viable political alternative. In America, labels are often used to suggest opponents have become too extreme. For the right, Obama was described as a socialist, fearing that he would doom America to collapse much like the USSR in the 1990s. The word fascist is used less often due to the association with the Holocaust, but you may hear it used from time to time. A version of socialism is still the official ideology of some countries like China, Vietnam, and Cuba. Socialist parties are often the major representatives of the left in Europe and Latin America. Fascists tend to appear only in extremist or fringe groups. Let's start with socialism and its variants. The first principle of socialism is a critique of markets and capitalism. Socialists believe that free market economies cause unacceptable inequality. This was originated by ideas from the German philosopher Karl Marx, who said that capitalism increased wealth for business owners, deepened poverty for workers, and to end exploitation of workers, government should own and manage all the production and investment. The second principle of socialism is that there is economic class conflict. Marx also wrote that fate in life depends on being born into a rich or poor family. Ideas of religion, culture, etc. are distractions from fundamental class conflict. There is a divide in socialism between communists and social democrats. Let's first focus on communism. Starting with the 1917 Russian Revolution, we saw how the Russians were successful in abolishing capitalism. Some advocates at this time preferred small communes instead of centralized government. But over time, the centralized government became dictatorial. A better name for communists would be state socialists. For social democracy, on the other hand, they believed that thought reforms, not revolution, would be enough to reduce this inequality. Social democracy worked within frameworks of liberal democracy and liberalism, and social democrats advocated for a nationalization of industries, unions, and welfare state programs. Today, socialists and social democrats are the left's main representatives in Europe and elsewhere. Most have dropped nationalization of the economic means of production as a goal. Socialists in Europe have moved more toward modern liberalism than American liberals have moved towards socialism. Now let's begin a discussion on fascism. Mussolini, Italian leader from the 1930s and 40s, rejected liberalism, capitalism, and socialism. Hitler, from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, thought that all kinds of people were enemies: Jews, homosexuals, communists, socialists, liberals. So why? Well, one principle of fascism is related to nationalism and national purity. This version of fascism arose in Europe in the 1900s, when liberalism and socialism were becoming more prominent. And those ideologies treated people equally as individuals or workers. But fascists believed that this left people without an identity. And so this would also lead to new levels of nationalism. This nationalism would celebrate shared culture and identity. Now at this time, some stories of shared culture had to be created, since Italy and Germany were relatively new countries. This nationalist ideal excluded non-members, and instead problems would be blamed on outsiders, such as Jews or immigrants. The core guiding principle of fascism is service to the homeland. The Nazis would also incorporate an intense racism. They believed in the concept of the Aryan master race, and anyone outside of that race was expendable. They killed 6 million people, estimated, in the Holocaust. The second principle of fascism is to find meaning in power and authority. This means they would reject classical liberalism and its visions. They believe that individuals accomplished little on their own, and that democracy created weak, divided leadership. Some advocated a will to power, like thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche. So, fascists believe that a powerful, dominant nation behind a heroic, absolute leader was the way to go. Mussolini's slogan was believe, obey, fight. And fascists would direct all resources to military power and state prestige. A third principle of fascism is defending mythical small-town life. Fascists imagined that they were defending villagers' wholesome, homogeneous way of life, i.e., the little guy. They hated socialists, intellectuals, and all forms of diversity. And they believed world war was necessary in order to preserve the culture. But over time, fascism would be delegitimized. Thanks to the defeat in World War II and the revelations of the Holocaust itself, the Nazis became the world's most recognized symbol of evil. However, there are some far-right parties in Europe today, which include strongly racialized national identity and an exclusion of immigrants. Figure 3.3 shows how fascism is seen as the extreme right. They do not share roots with other ideologies discussed. Now let's turn to some of the newer alternatives to the liberal tradition, environmentalism and Islamism. This is related to Learning Objective 3.4, identify the main principles of environmentalism and political Islamism. Ideology is always changing, with new agendas becoming politically salient. Recent decades are notable for religious revivals. Environmentalism would emerge as a political movement in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. Europe now has political parties called Greens or ecologists. The first principle of environmentalism is to value quality of life in a broad context. They reject other ideologies' economic and human-centered concepts of the good life. For example, Locke wrote that undeveloped land has almost no value. An environmentalist would disagree. They would argue that humans are part of nature, and our future depends on the health of the environment. Natural beauty and sustainability are fundamental values. The second principle of environmentalism is what's called the precautionary principle. Humans need to moderate to avoid overwhelming the planet. Environmentalists show concerns about population growth and global warming. They would say, if we wait to see if worst-case scenarios come true, it will be too late to respond. When it comes to environmentalism in relation to other ideologies, they are critical of liberals, conservatives, and socialists for ignoring environmental issues at times. However, they are almost always allied with the political left due to the receptive value of an active government. Political Islamism, on the other hand, is based on a certain radical interpretation of Islam. It should be noted that the vast majority of Muslims worldwide are not political Islamists. They are active in Iraq, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Afghanistan, and some have been linked to global terrorism, including the attacks of September 11, 2001. The first principle of political Islamism is to replace secular law with Sharia law. Sharia law is a strict interpretation of the principles and codes in the Quran as a way to defend against corrupt Western influences. They see a system of religious justice, restricting interactions between the sexes, and strict female dress codes is all important ways in which Sharia law can be practiced. This would also include strict interpretation of the principles and codes in the Quran as a way to defend against corrupt Western practices. They have an interest in barring blasphemy. Liberal rights and electoral democracy seen as illegitimate imports from the West. The second principle of political Islam is to defend and purify the Ummah. The Ummah represents the community of Muslims worldwide, and this would include a rejection of concepts of states, since all authority would come from Islam. The goal is to banish Western influence from traditionally Muslim lands. Unlike fascists and Soviets who took over other states, Osama bin Laden's goal in the 9/11 attacks was to reduce American influence in Saudi Arabia. The third principle is jihad. It means struggle, which is open to interpretation. Classic Islamic texts prohibit killing women and children, suicide, etc. However, martyrdom is strongly praised in the Quran, and terrorists have used these passages to justify their actions. In this photograph, Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi arrives to speak to a packed stadium in October 2012. A leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Morsi was elected in June 2012, but was deposed a year later by the Egyptian military, which accused him of abusing his power. Since then, the military has built a repressive regime of its own. Observers disagree over how much the Brotherhood would uphold Western-style democracy if it returned to power. The ideology of political Islam is profoundly different from dominant ideologies of liberal democracies. Not all Muslims are political Islamists, and not all political Islamists endorse violence. This figure shows how political Islam does not share branches with the other ideologies, yet it is closely rooted to the religious revelation that is a strand of the religious right and conservatism in general. In conclusion, let's see how people put ideologies into practice. There are opportunities for participating in parties, campaigns, rallies, and protests. The relevance of fascism and political Islam has risen despite lack of legitimacy in the West. These two ideologies rely on contrast with other ideologies. However, new alternatives are possible. They can be invented or mixed. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.